Introduction, Gateways to Art. So the first thing that we're going to do is just kind of go through the introduction of the book and just kind of really start getting you guys to think about art in general. And so what is art, right? And so one of the first questions that I always ask is, what is art to you, right? Art is going to be very different for everybody, right? But if I asked you to give me a definition, right, of what art is, right? Think about the idea of communication, right? So art communicates sensation. So if a lot of people, if you talk about ideas, emotions, right? And so this would be a good definition of art, right? It's a form of language, right? So it's expressing emotions, it's talking about ideas, right? And so when you sit and think about art, what is it to you, right? And again, there's no right or wrong in this. I'm just asking you to start thinking about what art is to you. This is Eduardo Corbra. This is a mural, and it was made for the Summer Olympics in Rio 2016. And so in this mural, which is the largest public mural in the world, it features colorful portraits of indigenous people, right? And so it's from 5 different continents. And so if you think about the idea of a mural being art, right, like, would you consider it art? And this is not your traditional, this is very contemporary. So if you think about that idea, like how people will kind of associate a mural and is it art? So the question that I want you to think throughout this semester is like to ask yourself, like, what is it? What you're looking at, is it considered art? Just because it's in the book, just because I showed it to you, like, do you consider it art, right? But I really want you to reflect on this and like be able to kind of tell me your perspective on this, right? And so when you think about art, right, you also have to think about the context of the thing that we've experienced. So like sometimes it's made out of, like, it could be made out of anything, right? So there's an artist that made sculpture out of his own blood, right? And so you have to kind of put yourself in there and think about the context. And some people will automatically say, oh, no, this isn't art because it's made out of blood. It's not traditional, right? So I want you to just kind of think about that idea of the context as well. This is Thomas Cole, the Oxbow. And so this piece was made to reflect the pride in the national expansion, right, of America, this kind of sublime power, this awe of nature, right? And so we're seeing this tree kind of being bent by this storm. The artist is shown in the lower center of the image, right? And so he's portraying himself really, really small. And then this grand, like, big, powerful storm, right? And so maybe even the idea of like how powerful nature is, right? And we're really insignificant. We're just very small, right? So that kind of idea of smallness of man, right? And so do you think about the context in that form, right? Like, this isn't just a landscape, it does have a message. This is Hans Hock. This is Condensation Cube, right? And so when we saw the other piece, the context was water, right? The storm. And then here, there's a different perspective on that idea, right? So here we're looking at a work of art that seems like a science experiment, right? And so you have these kind of physical properties of water and how it's affected by its surroundings, right? And so if you think about that, the box in this case is a metaphor for the building, right? For a museum building, right? And then the water represents the art inside the museum, right? And so if you're thinking about, like, if you could picture this, picturing a museum, and then the water inside, you're thinking about these are art pieces, right? And so this is more of a conceptual piece. We don't see the museum and we don't see the artwork, but it's more conceptual. So symbolism and stuff like that. And really what the artist is communicating here is that kind of fragility of art to the environmental conditions. So again, it's very different. It still has the same, like the context, water, but it could be very different, right? And so we're going to be looking at stuff like this that could be considered fine art, where other things will be considered craft or commercial art, right? And so when we kind of place these different types of categories, we also think about like the value of it as well, right? And so when I say value, not money, but value as in like importance, right? So in ancient Peru, for example, wool is valued very highly, right? In China, calligraphy is supposed to be the considered the highest form of art, right? And so as we're looking at these art pieces as well, think about like stuff like that. This would be a typical example of what we would consider high art, right? And so this is painted by a member of the Royal Art Academy, and these academies, these artists were trained and to be very technical, no brush strokes, right? So this is an example of high art. This would be an example of commercial art, right? So the FedEx symbol, and this design that was chosen from over 200 designs. What's very clever about this one, it's got its arrow right between the E and the X, right? And so if you think about FedEx, it suggests the idea of speed, right? But an example of commercial art. And if you think about like where these two things are found, right? The high art painting would be in a museum, whereas the commercial art piece could be in your book, it could be on a computer screen, it could be in the back of a truck, right? So just remember that art doesn't just belong in museums. You're going to find it in a lot of different places, right? And so there's a lot of speculation about, well, art belongs in a museum, right? This is the Louvre in Paris, France, right? But that's not necessarily true, because we find things that communicate, right, art pieces all over places, right, in different places, right? For example, in this tea bowl, this is a Japanese ceramic tea bowl, right? And so these ceremonies were really esteemed, and you think about the importance of these ceremonies, right? And so this cup or tea bowl is designed to inspire contemplation, right? And so you sit there and you look at the texture of the piece, right? And so again, you're seeing art on a cup, right? And so it can be found anywhere. You can find it inside of a church, right? And so the Basilica of St. Mary of Guadalupe in Mexico City, right? And so again, a symbol of importance, right, for a lot of Catholics, the Virgen de Guadalupe, again, found in a church. Also think about like art and creativity, right? Does an artist have to be trained? Or can they just be somebody that has like this creative impulse, right? Do you have to have a degree, right? And so kind of think about that as well as you're looking at these artworks, looking at the artist, right? And trying to consider that whole idea also about the role of creativity in your own life, right? And so things that I want you to start thinking about as we're looking at art. Don't just think about the artwork, also think about the artist. Sometimes it'll be an individual that creates an artwork. Sometimes we're going to see where an actual community builds an artwork. And so, there's very different ways of deciding who makes art, right? So if you think about the Renaissance, right? In the Renaissance, artists were just, before the Renaissance actually, artists were just kind of like craftspeople, right? But when the Renaissance came in, they actually became really famous and very important. Renaissance artists were like Michelangelo, Donatello, Raphael, right? And so, they become these great thinkers. This is the Mona Lisa, right? And so, this is more than just a portrait. right? It's also the idea of looking at a piece and the artist communicating this kind of idea of meditation of the human soul. Who thinks about something like that, right? Especially in these times, right? But this is the Renaissance. This is when these artists were thinking about these kind of idea of the individual, right? And that we can think for ourselves. And so there's like some great things happening in the Renaissance. And so that's what's being communicated in those pieces. So with the value of art also, like just kind of keep in mind that I'm not talking about so much as just the sale price, but also how the way it affects people, how it's valued either for its beauty or for the message that it has, right? And just kind of keep in mind that art has really this powerful effect on us, and it can really tell us about the human condition, right? And so keep that in mind as well as we start looking at that. That's one of the questions that I'll ask you a lot. This is Gustav Klimt, and the value behind this piece was this story, right? Because it was stolen by the Nazis. And so because of that story, this piece becomes valuable as well. This is Banksy, Love is in the Bin. So at an auction, this piece was sold for $1.4 million. And then right after it was purchased, there was an actual shredding machine inside that Banksy put it, and he shredded it. And so you can imagine the shock of the person that just bought the piece, and there it is being destroyed, right? And so he was really talking about this idea of criticizing commercialism in the art market, right? And so again, it has a important message. In the second part of the semester, we're really going to get into the power and the social role of art, right? And so talking about how it reflects social issues, how it can be used as a form of protest, and how it can really challenge a lot of people, right? And so also inspire change. And so a couple of examples really quick. We'll talk more about these pieces, but George Floyd's mural, right? A really important art piece, right? And so in this piece, right, he puts the words underneath, "I can breathe now," right? So in the 2001, when George Floyd was murdered, he kept saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." So here the artist puts, "I can breathe now," right? So just giving dignity to George Floyd. So the idea of studying art, right, and why it's important, right? It's really think about how we're going to use this class to really talk about interpreting works of art and using the Feldman method of art criticism, which is observation, analysis, interpretation, and judgment, right? And so we're going to look at the content, the meaning of the meaning or message behind it, and then also learning to see and experience new sensations and ideas, right? And so see what these art pieces actually have to teach us. So in the first part of the semester, what we're really going to start doing with the idea of studying art, basically going to go over the elements and principles of art, right? So we've got to learn the vocabulary and like the grammar of it so that we can talk about it, right? And so for the first part of the semester, we're really going to be talking about these different elements, what they do. And so, for example, color, how does color affect the painting? Form, line, mass, right? So it's easy to identify, but then also, how does the artist use it? How do they, what's the meaning behind it, right? And so we'll see the principles of art, which is like balance, contrast, emphasis, focal point. And so an artist will use a specific line, for example, to create a focal point, right? And so a lot of the times we look at these paintings and we have no clue that why our eye goes to something, but the artist does, and they did this on purpose, right? And so that's what we're going to kind of really focus on in the first part of the semester.